Okay, this first video we're making here is, remember in class that we talked about looking at rangelands from the standpoint of characterizing how much the land area is occupied by a plant, and we talked about how much is a canopy of the land. And I'm going to use this as a teaching tool more than I'm going to actually use it for what it was intended. This is actually called a Daubenmeier frame. But if you look at this frame, I've got it painted in different sections that represent a certain part of the frame. So if you can imagine this frame being closed up, it's a 2x5 decimeter frame, which the researchers have developed is a good strategy, the way to look at this. And if you can, in your mind's eye, draw a picture that goes up from here to here, that would represent 25% of the frame. This is 50% of the frame. This is 75% of the frame. And this small part of the frame represents 0 to 5% of the frame. And the way you use this is when you put it down on the ground, okay, and in your mind's eye, you take the particular component of the vegetation that you're going to look at, or the bare ground, or the litter, and you characterize into what category it would fit. So for example, in this plot, if you took all of this grass that you see growing right here, and you kind of in your mind's eye crushed it to one side of the plot, how much of the plot would you occupy? And the numbers that you use, and it's a multiple choice question, is do those grasses occupy 0 to 5, or 5 to 25, 25 to 50, or 50 to 75, or 75 to 95%, or practically all of the frame, 95 to 100%. So as I look at this, if I push this grass, this, which are all the kind of same species, and I pushed them over to one side, they probably occupy 5 to 25% of the frame. So that would be what you could record for that and say for that. Now if you look at this little fringe sage forest plant here, you know, this is about the only, well, we got this and we've got this. So that's probably in the 0 to 5 category on there. If we look at the lichens that are on the ground, that might be hard to see in this image, but you have lichens that are kind of dispersed all through the plant. Those lichens probably make up about about 25 to 50% of the frame. This little blue grama that you have over here, it probably occupies less than 0 to 5% of the frame. So that gives you an idea of how much canopy is being occupied by that. Now just to back up a little bit, canopy is what's exposed to the sky. I like to think about it as if a raindrop is falling, what is it going to intercept? So if I were to ask you how much bare ground is in here, there really isn't any bare ground. So you'd say that it's not present. So that would be a place to start from. Okay, now we can scale this up to get a better idea of how to look at this canopy and this vegetation. This plot is 2 meters by 5 meters in size. Okay, so it's a little bit bigger. So you've got a different component of plants in here. And if you look at the silver sage over here, if you imagined all of that pressed into one corner, you can say something about how much of this 2x5 frame is occupied by that silver sagebrush. And in this case, it's probably 5 to 25% of the frame is occupied. In this frame, you can see that there is some bare ground that shows up in here. Probably just over 5%, so you'd say 5 to 25% of the frame. There's quite a lot of fringe sagewort that you have in here, so it too would probably fall in that 5 to 25 range. And you could look at like the needle and thread grass that's in here and decide how much is there, as well as the blue grama. And you could also just lump them, well, how much is grass? So this I want you to see as kind of a training level of it. It's a way to look at the amount of canopy that you have in here. And when you go to characterize this vegetation community, you can say within a range about how much of the land area is covered with a certain set of plants. If you take what I've showed you in those quadrants and you've got your eye a bit calibrated, you should be able to start seeing how much of this land is occupied by what kind of plants. So as you look over the area that we're going to pan over, you can see an awful lot of fringe sagewort. You can see a little bit less silver sage. There's a fair amount of grasses that are in here. In time, as you train yourself and train your eye, calibrate your eye, you can say something about how much of the canopy is made up of a particular plant group or of a particular species as well. And that can be a really good description of what your land vegetation community is. So for out here, if I look at this, there's an awful lot of fringe sagewort that out here. I would probably put in this landscape that we've scanned across, you know, we probably have at least 5%, maybe even more than 25%, but it's certainly not more than 50%. So, you know, saying it's probably on that 25 to 50, at the low end of that would probably be an appropriate descriptor. You know, there's a fair amount of club moss that's in here. So just saying what you think the canopy is of that club moss would be useful. If I were to ask you how much of the land area is actually litter, vegetative litter, not broken glass, but litter, you know, you could say, well, it looks to me like there's probably 5 to 25% of the land area is covered with litter.